Hey scholars, today we're going to be talking about socialization and the life course, and I'm going to break this lecture up into a couple of parts. And the first part will focus primarily on what socialization is and the different agents of socialization that affect people's lives. In chapter 3, we talked about culture, and we said that culture embodied the ways that we do things, the material objects that we have in our world, and the use that we make of those material objects, which refers to our non-material culture. And I suggested then that chapter 4 would be about how we transmit that culture to the next generation. So today we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the socialization process and how it takes place and what we mean by that. And so we'll get a better definition and a better explanation and understanding, hopefully, of how that process takes place. Some of it is intentional and obvious and overt. Some of it is less intentional and just occurs through, children watching role models and parents, siblings doing things and learning from them without really consciously doing it. There are different processes at work here as we discuss the socialization process. So, as I mentioned to you, I think in chapter 3, when lay people, non-sociologists, talk about socializing, they're talking about just hanging out with friends and engaging in social activities. But when sociologists talk about socializing, now we're talking about an actual process where younger people learn how they're supposed to behave in different situations and what's considered to be acceptable and what's not acceptable. And so it's actually, like I said, it can be a very intentional, formal process when we send children to school to learn how to read and write and carry out solve math problems and things of that nature. We are intentionally trying to teach children things that they need to know in order to survive. But children learn in a lot of other settings as well, that when we're driving down the road, they watch us turn on our turn signal before we make a right or left turn. They're learning that, hey, if you're going to drive, you need to use your signals so that other people know when you're changing direction and things of that nature for safety purposes, okay? When we say things about somebody, a neighbor or something, and our children hear that, they're learning about our attitudes towards our neighbors, what we think of different neighbors, what we think of neighbors in general, what we think about specific neighbors and things of that nature. And so, children are born without prejudices. If you've ever seen small children playing with each other, they don't really care about people's skin color or the texture of their hair until they hear parents or other relatives or other people expressing hate or distrust or whatever towards another group. And they can pick up on that stuff, even if we don't intend for them to do so. They can pick up on things, and that can become a part of their thinking and the way they see the world as well. So you need to be very careful if you have children. You need to be very careful about the things that you say around them, because even though you may think that they're not paying attention to you, they absorb a great deal more than we're aware of. So let's talk about this process of socialization, what it's supposed to do, how it takes place, who the different agents of socialization are. As you can imagine, parents play a big role in the socialization process, but there are a lot of other factors that play a role as well. So we're going to talk about how the self develops according to symbolic interactionists and psychologists. We'll talk about a couple of psychological approaches. We'll talk about Freud and Piaget, but we'll also talk about sociologists who talk about how the self develops. The process of developing your sense of identity and your sense of self, how that happens, and some of the things that play a role in that. We're going to talk about, as I said, the agents of socialization, and of course family is probably the primary agent of socialization, but there are others as well. We'll talk about how people learn throughout the life process. We don't stop learning until we stop living. And so socialization is a lifelong process where you're not going to turn 18 or 22 years of age and we're going to say, oh, you're finished. Look, you're ideal. You don't have to grow anymore. You don't have to learn anything else. Society changes all the time, and the expectations that are placed on us as human beings in our societies can change as well. And we have to constantly grow and evolve and become better people if we want the world to be a better place. So we'll talk about how socialization continues throughout the life course, and even people who are retiring are having to learn to play the new role of retiree, and that can be challenging. So we'll talk about some of that. We'll talk about some of the different transitions that people make in life. When you go from an adolescent to a young adult and you leave high school and go to college, there's a transition there, and you have to adapt to the new circumstances. Once you become a college graduate and you start trying to form your family and you're dating with the purpose of perhaps getting married and having children, that's a period of transition in life when you have your first child. No matter how prepared you think you are not prepared. Having been a parent myself, I have a teenage daughter who is now 18 years old. And 18 years ago, I thought I was pretty well prepared to be a dad. But even though I knew a lot about parenting, I still had a lot to learn, and there are still mistakes to be made, right? So we continue learning throughout the life process. There are various transitions from teenager to young adult to adult seeking a significant other and some kind of relationship which might then develop into a family structure where there are children to be socialized and reared. And then when the children leave, there's that empty nest syndrome where people are now, free with their significant other again for the first time in perhaps 20 or 30 years. If you have several children, and you get those kids out of the house, and now you're there with your significant other, and you have to learn to be a couple again, because for many years you've just always been a part of a family group that went to eat and went camping and did, vacations together and all those kinds of things. But now it is you and your significant other together again to rediscover each other. And so, and then of course we know that when people start thinking about retirement, there's transitions there. So the point that I'm making here is that life is always changing. The expectations that people have of us are changing based on our different roles in life. Family members, parents are supposed to be more responsible. Those nights out at the bar, having fun, and all of that is supposed to, if not end, at least become less important, to become less significant. And family is supposed to then become the overriding responsibility that we have. And so, if you get fired from a job when you're 18 years old or 16 years old, it's not that big a deal. But if you're 28 years old and you've got a couple of kids and you get fired from your job, that can have more of an impact, not just on you, but on your children as well. And so life events that happen to us can have dramatically different import based on what stage of life we're in when it occurs. Okay, so we'll talk about all of these things as we go through this chapter. I think it's a great chapter. It's really one of my favorite chapters. I say that a lot. Seems like a lot of the chapters are my favorite chapters, but socialization is really important because it is the process that determines how you have become the wonderful people that you are and that you are growing into. Okay, so we'll start off with a definition of socialization, and your textbook says that it's the lifelong process where people learn the attitudes, values, and behaviors appropriate for members of a particular culture. It occurs through our interactions with the people around us. Our parents, as I said, get us first, and they have an impact on us for the first 4 or 5 years of our lives, particularly if we are fortunate enough to have a parent at home and we're not in daycare or preschool and things of that nature, and we get a lot of time one-on-one with a parent. My mom was a stay-at-home mom for the first 5 years of my life, actually for longer than that. But, when I was 5, I went to kindergarten, and she had less of an impact on me then, but still a tremendous impact. But, being at home with my mom, she taught me a lot. She took good care of me, and she exposed me to various educational programs on television that would let me learn how to read and write, and at least identify letters and sounds and things of that nature. She would read to me quite often at night when it was bedtime. She would certainly read a story to me and try to foster in me a desire to learn to read. And that's all important parts of the socialization process. But today, of course, we know that families are often required to have multiple people in the labor force, and so mom and dad, or dad and dad, or mom and mom may all be working, may both be working, and we may have to resort to using daycare or babysitters or family members who can watch our children. And so we're allowing someone else then to help socialize our children. So when you're looking for a daycare center, keep in mind that not only are you looking for someone who can take care of your child and make sure that your child is safe, but that those individuals are also going to have an impact on what your child learns. The other children there and the daycare workers will all have an impact on what your child learns. So, keep that in mind as you start thinking about child care. Okay, it certainly begins in infancy, from the very moment that we bring our child home from the hospital, either wrapped in a blue blanket or a pink blanket. They are going to be treated differently based on the color of that blanket, and they will start learning what it means to be a male or a female in our society from very early on. Okay, and really it can even start before the child is born. Today, because we can do amniocentesis or sonograms and find out what the biological sex of our child is going to be, we can start buying toys and painting and decorating the nursery before the child is even born. And so we start gendering our child when we start thinking about what are we going to name our child. We're going to have a boy, so what are we going to name it? The names that are available for boys are generally different from the names that are available for girls, although Jackie, number of names are kind of can be used for either a boy or a girl. Ashley. There are a number of names that can be used either for a son or a daughter. And so we start gendering our child from the very beginning. From the very moment that we find out that we're expecting to have a child, we can start gendering it. Okay, so socialization is that process whereby human beings essentially become human. They learn the rules that govern society. Children who grow up with a lack of socialization have poor social skills in most cases, have poor cognitive development, and they struggle to communicate and form bonds with other people. So this really is the process of becoming a human being. And it may vary a little bit from culture to culture, but there are some universals in that regard. We'll also talk about how our personalities develop. We'll talk a little bit about that, particularly when we get to the explanations for how the self develops. We'll talk about Freud and Piaget, as I mentioned, and their ideas about how personality develops. Now, the personality is a little bit different from the self. The personality refers to a person's typical patterns of attitudes, needs, characteristics, and behavior. And in general, I would say that our personalities become set fairly early in life. And so our core personality doesn't change a whole lot unless there's some kind of life-changing event, a near-death experience or something like that. But if you're a quiet, introverted person, you're typically going to remain that kind of person, a quiet, introverted person, most of your life. You may have situations where you're required to go out and look like an extrovert, lead group sessions and lecture and things of that nature, but your core personality, your comfort zone is still that quiet, introverted personality, okay? But the sense of self, the self evolves throughout your life time. You're going to change and grow as a person, but your core personality will typically remain fairly stable unless there's some kind of event that produces a dramatic change. Okay, so we've talked about microsociology and macrosociology. The microsociological perspective is what we're going to be focusing on in Chapter 4 because we're looking at the process of how an individual becomes the person that they grow into as an adult. And that focuses on the individual, right? And so the microsociological perspective says that socialization helps people discover how to behave properly and what to expect from others if we follow society's norms and values. Okay, the macro sociological perspective says that socialization provides for the transmission of a culture from one generation to the next. So the micro sociological perspective, symbolic interactionism, is going to focus on how we become the people that we grow into, whereas the macro sociological perspective is going to focus on, hey, this is a process that occurs that allows us to transmit our culture from one generation to the next, and it's valuable for that reason. The functionalist would say that it's valuable because we have to develop some kind of consensus on what's right and wrong in order for society to function smoothly. Conflict theorists, on the other hand, might say that having to develop a dominant ideology and adapt other people's cultural practices can be limiting. And it can harm people who come from a different culture and then who are treated differently because of their cultural heritage. And so the conflict theorists are going to say that, well, culture does serve some functions, but sometimes those functions are to maintain the status quo. And of course, we know that conflict theorists tend to advocate change and greater equality. And so they may see that as an impediment to change and equality. Okay. The idea is then how much of your personality and who you are and your sense of self, is born into you, and how much of it comes from the environment. So we've had this nature versus nurture argument. You've probably had this discussion before. Are you born a particular way, or do you grow into it? We know that it's very, very difficult to isolate how much of our self or our personality is born into us and how much of it develops as we start to evolve and grow as human beings. And at this point, at least, it's absolutely impossible to determine how much of our behavior is nature and how much of it is nurture. But I will say this. There was a time when sociologists believed that all human behavior was learned, and they were adamant about that. But today, we acknowledge that the sociobiology plays a role as well. That males and females are certainly different from each other in some important ways, both in terms of muscle mass and strength. Of course, exercise and working out really hard can change that. But there are also some biochemical changes or differences between males and females. Around puberty, we know that males start to excrete a great deal more testosterone, and of course, females tend to excrete estrogen and other female hormones, and those are connected to some behaviors, okay, and some maybe even some thought processes. We can't really untangle how much is nature and how much is nurture at this point. So sociologists have decided, hey, let's quit trying to fight this argument. Let's just talk about the interplay between your biology and your environment and how that produces the person that you grow into. Okay. So that nature versus nurture debate rages on, and it certainly won't be answered in my lifetime. It might be answered during your lifetime, that so much of your behavior and your personality is inborn into you, but this much tends to be environmentally focused. Someday there may be an answer to that, but certainly not, I don't think, in my lifetime. Okay, so it's this interplay between your biology, your heredity, and the environment that you grow up in, whether that tends to exacerbate differences or to minimize differences in your personality versus someone else. Okay, so the importance of this socialization process can be demonstrated just by looking at children like Isabel. Isabel was, she was born to a woman who was deaf, and therefore she didn't speak. But she was born out of wedlock, and her grandparents were very ashamed that their daughter had gotten pregnant without being married, and so they isolated the child up until she was 6 years of age. And then Isabel and her mother fled, and authorities discovered this young lady who had never really had much human contact. Her mother would take care of her needs in terms of feeding her and clothing her, but because her mother was deaf and didn't speak, that really created a barrier there in terms of communication and language and developing, all of that. Isabel, when she was discovered at 6 years of age, couldn't speak, and she used very simple gestures. She might do this to indicate that she was hungry, but she really was cognitively delayed and emotionally and socially delayed. But Isabel was pretty fortunate, and she must have been a pretty bright child, because by the time Isabel was in middle school, she was attending class with her kids her own age. By the time I think she was 14, she was going to school with kids her own age. I suspect that there were still some cognitive and social lags that were occurring. She probably didn't make friends very easily at that point. She probably still struggled cognitively. She wasn't quite up with her classmates, but she, through intensive socialization, she was able to overcome a lot of that social isolation that occurred early in her life. Specialists developed special programs to help socialize her and teach her the things that she'd missed out on the first 6 years of her life. We can also look at Romanian orphans who, spent hours and hours in a crib or a bed in isolation from other kids and other human beings. Their physical needs were taken care of, but their emotional needs and their needs for, a bond with another human being that typically occurs between parents and children wasn't there. And so those kids were also cognitively and emotionally delayed. They did not form good friendships and relationships, as easily as most of us are able to. These kids were, isolated from each other up until about 5 years of age when they started going to school, and they were very poorly socialized as well. And they had those same kinds of delays that we saw with Isabel. Okay. In those orphanages, they would be isolated from each other for 18 to 20 hours a day with just a feeding bottle and just a little bit of care from adults, but not a whole lot. We can also look at primate studies. Harlow and others have done primate studies where they would take infant monkeys away from their parents and raise them in isolation. And what they found was that those little monkeys did not develop good social skills. They didn't bond. They would be very needy. And so if you put a stuffed animal in a cage with a monkey that had been raised in isolation, they would grab onto that stuffed animal and hold on to it and become almost neurotic in their desire to hold on to that. Because they needed that touch, they needed that connection with another being, and certainly, human beings are not like monkeys, but we're a lot like monkeys in a lot of ways, and I think that those studies help to demonstrate that it's really, really important to children to have that connection and that bond and that warmth and that nurturing from a parental figure. It doesn't have to be a parent, but it needs to be a parental figure who makes the child feel loved and accepted and desired and protected. Feeling loved and feeling desired and feeling protected is really an important part of our childhoods. And kids that don't get that from a parental figure, it doesn't mean that they can't live a normal life, but it does mean that it's going to be more difficult, that they're going to encounter challenges that they don't really know how to deal with because they've never formed a a bond with another person. So if we look at all of these studies of primates, Harlow studies, the rhesus monkeys, and all of these different studies that look at primates, it just reemphasizes that growing up in a nurturing environment where you're not constantly fearful, where you feel protected, where you feel wanted is incredibly important to human beings, just as it is to animals and things of that nature. Now, in that old nature versus nurture argument, we've done some twin studies where we looked at kids who were identical twins who were raised separately from each other due to adoptions. And so what we found is, well, first of all, our number of twin pairs is pretty small. 137 sets of identical twins that were raised separately from each other. That's not a large sample size, okay? But here are some things that we can say about the Minnesota twin studies, is that kids who were raised in similar environments, okay? So if you had these two identical twin boys, one was adopted by a family in Minneapolis and one was adopted by a family in St. Paul. If those families were similar to each other in things like socioeconomic status and structure, those two young men, even though they were raised separately from each other, would have some similar traits. If, on the other hand, those two young men were raised in different environments, one went to an upper middle class family and one went to a lower class family, they tended to be more different from each other. They would still have some things in common with each other, but they would have less in common with each other than twin pairs that were raised in similar environments. So environment does play a role, but heredity is also important. We know that some of these twins would have really interesting similarities, even though they had never even met each other. They would have some things in common with each other, but they would also have some variations in their attitudes and behaviors depending on the household that they were raised in. And the more different those households were, the more different their attitudes were likely to be. So both nature and nurture, again, are important in this process of becoming who we are growing into. Okay, we need more research. This is really a preliminary study, and there are certainly some ethical considerations. If we're raising twins separate from each other, that needs to be something that happens because people can't raise their children and they have to give them up for adoption. It can't be something that's manipulated by researchers. There are ethical issues there, obviously. And we have to be careful about that kind of research. And by, having a very small sample here, we can't really generalize to all human beings because we're only looking at 137 sets of twins. So that's something to be considered as well. We're going to talk about how the self emerges. You know who you are. You know that you have certain likes and dislikes. You know that you are unique. There's not a single person on this planet who is identical to you. Okay, even identical twins have variations. My sister grew up playing softball with a pair of identical twins. One was right-handed, one was left-handed, one was good in English, one was good in math. Better. They were both pretty good in both, but they were, they had different traits that they were better at than their sibling. And so even though they have shared DNA, genetic material, there are still variations in their behavior. Those genes may be expressed in different ways. They have different fingerprints, things of that nature. So there are still differences between them, even though they have the same genetic input. They're identical twins, but they are different. Some of those genes will manifest in one way and the other one a different way. Okay, but let's talk about the self. The self is the distinct identity that sets us apart from others. So I've asked you guys to work on an assignment, and the assignment asks you to talk a little bit about who you are, some things about you that are unique or interesting, or make you who you are, that are the essence of who you are. And I want you to think of where that came from in terms of your family, your educational experiences, your peer relationships, what you've seen in the media, all of these different agents of socialization have had an impact on you, significant others in your life. And, normally we think of significant others as being a spouse, perhaps, or if you're a child, your significant other might be your parent. That's certainly true, but sometimes significant others can be a baseball coach who saw something in you as a person, not just your baseball ability, but saw something in you and took you an interest in you and influenced you to become a better person. Or, it might be the peer group who encourage you to do things that get you in trouble. They can be significant others as well. And so sometimes, getting involved in juvenile delinquency, there might have been a friend, a particular friend, your best friend, who encouraged you to do all kinds of things that ended up getting you in trouble. And that person would still be a significant person in your life. We tend to think of families as places where we're nurtured and loved and cared for. That's not always the case, unfortunately. We know that far too many children are neglected or emotionally abused or even physically or sexually abused. And so those events can have a tremendous impact on how you feel about yourself and how you feel about your place in the world. With therapy, we can sometimes overcome some of those hardships, and we can grow through some of that stuff. And, so it's not, if you've been the victim of abuse, that's not an indication that you're never going to be a functioning adult. We can certainly overcome those things that have happened to us, but they will still have made an impact on us in some way. Maybe we're a little less trusting of other people. Maybe we don't understand exactly what the role of a parent is. And so we have to learn from, mass media and friends and reading books and things of that nature, how parents should provide an emotionally healthy environment for their children to grow up in. It's, parenting is tough, and with all the stresses that life brings with us, the financial stresses and the relationship stresses and raising children and all being pulled in lots of different directions, it is very difficult to raise children in a healthy environment and it's impossible to always make the right decisions, right? My parents were loving parents. They love me to this day. I feel loved. I always felt loved, but I'm sure that they made a few mistakes along the way, but they weren't huge mistakes, thankfully. They always encouraged me to explore, books and different ideas about how to live my life and to learn and grow. They really fostered a desire to learn. They're probably largely responsible for me teaching sociology and being with you this semester, because they encouraged me to go out and get an education and read as much as I could read and become the best JackHarred that I could be. But I'm sure they made some mistakes. They were a little overprotective probably when I was a teenager, but, I probably still chafe a little bit about that. But the reality is that they were able to protect me from, getting involved in a lot of juvenile delinquency and doing things, my cousins, I used to hang out with my cousins, and my parents would tell me, we really don't want you hanging out with your cousins. And they were probably right about that, because some of those cousins have struggled. They've had issues with substance abuse and staying productive and keeping holding a job. And, the fact that my parents really discouraged me from hanging out with those cousins probably had me develop a little bit different view of what life should be like and to set different kinds of goals, So when parents try to keep you from hanging out with certain friends and doing certain things, they're probably not trying to be mean to you. They're trying to keep you from making mistakes that could have dramatic impact on the rest of your life. But as a teenager, that can be very difficult to understand and to accept. They don't know anything. They're old folks. They don't remember what it's like to be young. They've been old so long, they don't know what it means to be young anymore. And so they're just trying to, harsher fun. But that's really not what parents are trying to do. They're trying to protect you, trying to give you a basis, a starting point, a platform in life that will allow you to go on and grow and develop skills and become marketable in the economy, and to live a good life, free of drugs and substance abuse and all those criminal records and all those kinds of things. Okay, so when we talk about the self, we know that it is something that changes throughout the lifetime, the life process, all the different transitions. You're constantly changing. It's not something that stays the same. It's not static. It changes throughout life. And sociologists and psychologists are both interested in this process. And as I said, we're gonna talk about Freud's theories and Piaget's theories on how the self develops, but we're also going to talk about Charles Horton Cooley and Irving Goffman and George Herbert Mead and how they view this process of the development of the self. Okay, so let's talk about some of these folks. We'll start out with Charles Horton Cooley and his Cooley's looking glass self. And so this is a concept that was developed by, as I said, Charles Horton Cooley, and it emphasizes that the self is a product of our interactions. Okay, so he was really focusing on how a child interacts with a parent or how a child interacts with someone else. And, if you think about a toddler, they're looking at mom and dad, looking for approval, looking for a smile or encouragement. And they may do things sometimes to get our attention and to try to get our approval. So you might see a child walking towards the television with a spoon in their hand, a large spoon, and they're going to go and smack on the screen, and they look back at us as they get close to the television, and they kind of got that little mischievous smile on their face, and they're thinking about smacking the television with the spoon, and you say, no, don't do that. And maybe the child chooses not to do it, or they keep going and you have to go and take the spoon away from them and perhaps swat them on the hand or on the bottom, and you say, no, you can't do that, because you're teaching the child that if they smack the TV with their spoon, they're going to break the TV. And so you're teaching them not to do that. That's an inappropriate behavior, and you're discouraging it. Sometimes kids will repeat things that we as parents say. And if they catch you off guard, if they repeat something, perhaps some adult language, sometimes it'll catch us off guard and we'll laugh. And that laugh can reinforce that behavior. So now you've got your child going around the house, walking up to everyone in the house and repeating that word, looking at the reaction. And usually there's some shock and some horror, and then sometimes followed by a laugh. And that can be very reinforcing. It can really be difficult to extinguish that behavior and make them understand that you shouldn't be saying those words. It's going to get you in trouble. My daughter, for example, when she was in first grade, she was coloring, and the teacher was standing behind her in the classroom while she was coloring. And I guess she made a mistake. She got outside the line or something, and the teacher heard her say a word that, my wife at the time looked at me and said, "That's your fault." Okay, so probably at some point I had used that word in frustration, and my daughter had overheard it and decided that was an appropriate word to use when she was frustrated. And of course, she got in trouble, a little bit of trouble, and of course I got in trouble. Everybody was fussing at me for perhaps using that language in front of my daughter. So children are seeking approval, and if we laugh about things that we really don't want to encourage, we can encourage behavior that we disapprove of. But this process of the looking glass self is the idea that as that child is looking at their parent, they're looking for signs of approval and affection. They want to please the parent, but when they look at our expression, perhaps we have a furrowed eyebrow and we're trying to tell them this is inappropriate behavior. I don't want you doing this. Or maybe it's nothing related to them at all. Maybe we came home from work and we're really frustrated and we're very angry from being at work, and our child interacts with us and we're scowling, and they think that they've done something wrong, even though your mood and your expression has nothing to do with them. They pick up on those vibes of frustration and anger, and they internalize it. Okay, it's like they're looking in a mirror, looking for something that makes them feel good about themselves, and what they get from you when they see your expression and your body language is they get disapproval, and they internalize that, and that makes them feel less secure, less loved, less emotionally healthy. Okay, so having said that, that doesn't mean that every minute you're around your children, you have to be supportive and loving and nurturing. That's impossible. We can't do that. But keep in mind that if the majority of the time that you spend with your children is involved in shouting and anger and furrowed brows and body language that indicates disapproval, that the child may grow up feeling insecure and uncomfortable about who they are as a person. So, it is important that we try to provide a nurturing environment for our child where they feel accepted by their parents, even though they may have done something that we disapprove of. It's not the child that we disapprove of, it's the behavior. Okay, so there are 3 phases of this looking glass self that Cooley talked about. The first one, we imagine how we present ourselves to others. And so as we're thinking about who we are as people, as we're thinking about our interactions with others, we're imagining how other people perceive us, how we go out and behave in a certain way, and we imagine how others then evaluate that. Okay, so that's step 2. We imagine how we present ourselves to others. That's step 1. And then we imagine how they perceive that. That's step 2. And then the third step involves we develop feelings about ourselves as a result of what we think other people think of us. Okay, this is an unconscious process. It happens without us really intentionally trying to develop feelings about ourselves. It occurs early on in life, and if you've got a parent who tells you you are smart and you are capable and you can do anything in the world that you put your mind to, and their behavior backs that up, then chances are you're going to grow up to feel like, hey, I'm pretty capable. I can do things. Okay. If, on the other hand, your parents either say that they think you can do anything, but then they always end up helping you and bailing you out when you struggle, or if they just openly say, I've got a kid that can't do anything. What's wrong with this kid? You'd think that, well, gosh, nobody's going to say that about their kids, but people say those things and even much worse things about their children sometimes. So when children feel that they've let their parents down and they've not lived up to their expectations, that can have a dramatically negative impact on how they feel about themselves. Well, I might as well not go to school and try to excel because my parents tell me I'm dumb all the time anyway, so I can't learn. Why would I bother wasting my time going to school? Okay, so it can really have a dramatic impact on the way the child sees themselves and whether they see themselves as a capable, individual who is going to struggle sometimes. I mean, we all have struggles, right? Let me give you an example here. My daughter was working on some math problems when she was in high school. She's graduated now, but when she was in high school, she was really struggling with some of these math problems. And she said, Dad, I'm just no good at math. And I said, well, now, wait a minute. I want you to think about that statement. I can't learn math. I'm no good at math. I said, when you got on your skateboard, were you really good at it the first time you got on it? Well, no, I fell and broke my ankle. Yeah, but you didn't quit skateboarding, right? And today, you're a pretty good skateboarder. And when you first picked up your clarinet, how did it sound when you first blew on it that first day in class? Oh my gosh, there were squeaks and noises coming out of that clarinet that aren't supposed to come out of a clarinet, right? And she said, yeah, Dad, you're right. And I said, well, so you didn't quit playing the clarinet, right? And the next year, when band started, what chair were you? Well, I was second chair. Well, gosh, that means that you must have done pretty well learning to play that clarinet just in a year, right? I said, if you would put as much time into learning to play the clarinet or into learning your math problems, solving math problems, practicing that you put into riding that skateboard and playing that clarinet, gosh, just imagine how successful you could be. Okay, so I think it's important for us to encourage our children in that way. And yes, they're going to struggle with various things. Not every child has the same level of ability and quickness to pick things up as other children, but there may be something else that, hey, that's in their wheelhouse and they just have a natural talent to play the guitar, for example, or to solve math problems or whatever. All kids have their unique talents and abilities, and we certainly want to encourage those, but we also want to encourage them in those areas where they struggle. And yes, they may fail from time to time. They may not do well on a math test. They may, have problems with solving certain kinds of equations. But if we give them that sense of, hey, I am capable, I just have to keep working. I know I can learn this. I just need to keep working hard at it, and I'm going to get it eventually. That persistence will allow them to be successful, even though that may not be something that they have a particular skill in. We can learn to be adequate in those things that we struggle with, and we can learn to be exceptional in those things that we're good at naturally. Okay? So I think it's important that parents communicate to their children that, failure is not an end. Failure is a step in learning to be successful. And so, yes, you may make a C on that math test, but next time you're going to work a little harder and bring that up to a B. And eventually, you're going to keep working hard at it until you're able to not just be adequate, but to have skill in these various areas. Okay, so Cooley's Looking Glass Self says that the child imagines how they present themselves to other people. They imagine how those people perceive them and develop evaluations of us, and then we allow those feelings. Think about the child who is constantly accused of stealing things and being a little juvenile delinquent. If they internalize that and say, well, gosh, everybody thinks I'm a bad kid, I might as well be a bad kid. Maybe I am a bad kid. And so then they start to engage in the behaviors that they've been accused of, although maybe those accusations were false accusations. Okay? But it can have an impact on how you see yourself, and then subsequent behaviors can result from that. Okay? George Herbert Mead is kind of, as we've talked about, he's considered the father of the symbolic interactionist approach, and he developed a theory on how children develop and evolve. And he said that there were basically 3 stages in the development of the self. The first stage is what he called the preparatory stage, and the preparatory stage is just what it sounds like, as a toddler, as an infant. Children don't have the ability to communicate very much. Their sense of self hasn't developed yet. There's no self present, and children early on just imitate the people around them. So they start making sounds, and eventually those sounds are formed into their first word, and they start to speak, and they start to develop some language skills, and they tend to imitate the people around them. So if dad's in the driveway and he's under the car changing the oil, the child may get their toy truck and some tools, a hammer and a screwdriver, and pretend that they're working on their toy truck. They don't know what dad's doing under the car. They just know that he's got tools and he's doing something, and they are imitating the behavior. So it's a very, very low level of understanding there, of just trying to imitate. But children then will gravitate towards the play stage. And in the play stage, they start to become more aware of relationships. And so they may play house, where here's my baby doll, and I'm going to be the daddy, or I'm going to be the mommy. And this is what a mommy does, and they take care of the baby and that kind of stuff. So there's still some imitation going on there, but now they start to, they're imitating based on different relationships. This is a mother does this. This is a child, the child does that. And so now they're pretending to be other people, right? And then there is the, and another thing I want to mention about the play stage is role taking. And role taking is defined as the process of mentally assuming the perspective of another and responding from that imagined viewpoint. So in that play stage, as kids start understanding relationships, they start engaging in some role taking. And so, like I said, they'll play we're going to play school, so I'm going to be the teacher, and here are my students. I've got all my stuffed animals and my baby dolls lined up in chairs, desks around the room, and those are my students. And so they start taking on the role of the teacher. Okay, and then that brings us to the third stage, which Mead titled the game stage. And he said here, what's interesting about this stage is that children now not only understand their own roles, they are starting to understand the roles of others and how those things all mesh together. So children somewhere around the ages of 8 to 9 are no longer just playing roles, but they are starting to understand the social positions that they occupy and the social positions of others. And they often use games to kind of demonstrate that. So if you think about the Little League World Series, okay, these kids are between 10 and 12 years of age. A few of them have turned 13 when you get to the Little League World Series. They've had a birthday, and so they're now 13. But most of these kids are 11 and 12 years of age. Think about your nephew or niece who played t-ball, or maybe you played t-ball. When you're playing t-ball, you're maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years of age, and you don't know much about what you're supposed to do when you play baseball, right? So you know that you hit the ball. Your coaches tell you about when you catch the ball, you throw the ground ball to first base. Make a throw to first base and try to get the runner out. But we don't really know much about baseball as t-ballers. So I use the example of, let's say we've got a situation where there's a runner on third base and there's one out, and the batter hits the ball back to the pitcher. Of course, we know in t-ball there's not an actual pitcher, but there's somebody out there who fields the pitcher's position, even though they're not pitching the ball to the batters. Okay, so in t-ball, you've got that person out there standing out there on the mound, occupying the position of pitcher. There's a ground ball hit back to them. What do we tell that child to do? Throw the ball to first base and get it out, right? You might say, well, throw the ball home and get the runner out coming home. But what if the runner doesn't run? Now the batter runs to first base and they're safe there, and the runner at third base who did not run is safe at third base. And you still have no out, or you still just have the one out, okay? So we just want the child to throw to first base and get it out because it's t-ball. The score is going to be 29 to 26 anyway. And so, trying to stop every single run to try to win the game is not the focus. The focus is in learning how to play baseball, okay? But by the time those kids get to Little League, and if they make it to the Little League World Series, you're talking about kids that have been coached a lot. They've learned a lot about baseball. They now know that when that ground ball is hit back to the pitcher should catch the ball, look at the runner at third base, and make him or her go back to third base before turning and throwing the ball to first base to get the out. And he knows the pitcher knows that the third baseman is going to cover his bag, and the catcher is going to step up and be prepared to take a throw if the runner is breaking from third base. The pitcher's going to throw home, and the catcher's going to catch it and hopefully put the tag on the runner. And so they know what everybody's going to be doing. And meanwhile, the first baseman, even though the pitcher is looking at third base and making that runner go back, the first baseman is going to cover his or her bag so that if the pitcher turns around to get the out, they're covering their bag and they can catch the ball. And as soon as they catch the ball and get the out, they're going to start moving towards home plate in case that runner on third base decides to try to break for the plate and score. Okay? So that involves a level of understanding that goes far beyond what a 6 or 7 year old t-baller can understand. But somewhere around the ages of 8 and 9, kids start to become aware that, hey, all these things have to work together. And think about it on a football team. If you're running a play, It's important that not only you know what you're supposed to do, but you kind of know what everybody else is supposed to do, so that if somebody misses their assignment, you can still make the play. Or if if something breaks down and one of the players on the other team does something unexpected, you know how to adjust to it. And so by the time we get to that game stage of the development of the self, not only do we understand our role within the family, but we understand what mom and dad are dealing with, and we might be empathetic for our parents when they're struggling with financial concerns, or there's something going on at work that's got them really. We might think, well, gosh, dad's really stressed out right now. I would like to ask him for permission to go to summer camp this year, but it's probably not a good time, so I'm going to think about a time when maybe dad's not quite as stressed out. Maybe then I can ask him and approach him and ask him about going to summer camp. So kids are starting to develop a greater awareness, not only of the roles that they're playing, but the roles of the people around them. And that's when they've developed into what Mead called the game stage. Okay. Now, sociologists talk about, particularly George Herbert Mead, talk about the significant other and the generalized other. These are not steps in the development, but they are entities that can influence us. So, as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about significant others, we're talking about people who have played an important part in our lives. For most of us, our parents are significant others. Our coaches might be significant others, our Sunday school teachers, our teachers in the public schools, or if we're lucky enough to go to private school, those teachers might qualify as significant others. Later on, your peers become significant others, and eventually you marry someone, perhaps, or you form a committed relationship, and that person then is a significant other. And so significant others are just people that have an impact on us. Well, generalized others can also have an impact on us, but it's not a specific person or a specific entity. It's our perceptions of society and their attitudes. Okay, so the generalized other is defined as the attitudes, viewpoints, and expectations of society as a whole that a child takes into account in his or her behavior. So a child at some point will take something, quite often at the grocery store, perhaps they grab a candy bar that mom said they couldn't have, or something like that, and they swipe it, they hide it. They may later on in life think, well, gosh, I better not take this candy bar. I want it, but I don't have $1.50, so I better not take it because people will see me as a thief. Okay, that's when that child has started to develop a concept of the generalized other, and they've started to internalize society's expectations. Well, I don't want people thinking that I'm a bad person, so I won't do this. Or I want people to think I am a good person, so I will do this. Or I want my peer group to accept me, so I will drink alcohol underage, or I will smoke marijuana with my friends in order to fit in. We're being impacted by the generalized other when we start to think about what other people think about us. If we allow that to influence our behavior, we're starting to become cognizant of that generalized other, and we're beginning to internalize society's expectations. Sometimes we reject those expectations, right? But sometimes, quite often, we accept those expectations, and whether we reject them or accept them, they've had an impact on us, right? Okay, so that's Mead's stages of the self. The preparatory stage from birth to about probably around 2 years of age. Then the play stage, where children are imitating parents without really much understanding of what they're imitating. And then the game stage, where they start to understand their role and how their roles interplay with the roles of the people around them, whether we're talking about a game setting or their position in a family or the role that they play in the school play or whatever, and how that role interacts with the other characters. The game stage is that third stage in the development of the self. And of course, Mead said that significant others and generalized others both have an impact on our behavior, or can. Okay. All right. Having a little trouble with my. So that's probably a good place to take a little break. We're right at an hour, so I'm going to take a little break, and then we'll get into some more explanations of the development of the self and how that all works. So hang in there, and I'll be back shortly.